With more on this, we are joined by Hillel Neuer. He is the executive director of UN Watch, which is a human rights NGO in Geneva. Hillel, the Security Council hearing these reports, but any real chance that it is going to translate into real action, of course, with that Russia and China veto hanging over everything?
The short answer is no. Regrettably, you have a combination of the political blocking by China and Russia, which effectively prevents any adoption of a Security Council resolution. But in addition to that, let's be frank, the international community has not always waited for a Security Council resolution. Let's recall in Bosnia, back in the late 90s, there was no Security Council resolution. Once again, there were blocking states, and America and NATO, including the Europeans, went in and protected the victims of Kosovo. And there have been other examples like that. And we're not seeing any political will by the United States, by European powers such as France, Britain, Germany, to intervene in the Syrian situation, which for a variety of reasons is different from the Libyan situation last year.
Your organization is calling Russia, China, and Cuba to have their Human Rights Council memberships suspended. How realistic is that, and what will it achieve?
Well, it's an interesting question. You know, 2 years ago, when Colonel Muammar Gaddafi's Libyan regime was re-elected to the Human Rights Council, we led a protest campaign, first to fight the election itself, and then after he was elected, to remove him. And, you know, we gathered 70 human rights groups from around the world, and we brought victims of Libyan torture to testify, and we all called for the council to enforce its own provision, which says that governments, members of the council that commit gross and systematic violations can be suspended. And when we called for it back then, our chances were nil, because the world was with Gaddafi. And when he was elected, not a single country in the world, not even Britain, not France, not even America, protested. So when we started our campaign back then, there were zero chances. And yet, a year later, war broke out, atrocities being committed by Gaddafi. And what do you know? The Human Rights Council remembered that provision, and they removed him. So I'll be honest and say that today, China, Russia, and Cuba have the full support and confidence of a large swath of countries that hate America and that want to side with their rivals. And so today it's not realistic, but on these issues you have to lead the way, speak the truth, and you never know when it'll be implemented. And let me tell you, China, Russia, and Cuba do not belong as world judges on human rights when they not only enable mass murder in Syria, but also systematically violate the human rights of their own citizens. It's a sick joke. They shouldn't be there.
Tunisia, which was the country that started off this whole Arab Spring, as we know, more than a year ago, is now offering Bashar al-Assad asylum in the country. Will human rights proponents, do you think, be satisfied with that option? A lot of commentators say there's really only one way out of the country for Assad, and it is certainly not asylum in Tunisia, if you know what I mean.
Yes, I do. And I think this is a complicated issue, and probably most human rights activists would say, well, Assad needs to go to the International Criminal Court, and there cannot be any compromises with justice. At the same time, you have the reality that millions of people are being subjugated and thousands are being killed in the most horrific ways. It's shocking that a government, the leader of whom was recently, a year ago, feted in European capitals, the Americans called him a reformer, is turning heavy artillery on his own cities. And it's hard to imagine that this country is doing these things, and yet it is. So of course he belongs in the International Criminal Court, and he deserves the strongest punishment that the ICC could have. And yet there are, if we could find a solution that could take this guy away and could rescue millions of people, certainly we'd have to consider that. So I think there's a moral dilemma here between, you might call it justice and peace, justice and the right to life, and I'm not sure it's easily resolved.
Hillel, what are the dangers of the international community not interfering in Syria? I mean, dangers not just to Syrians, but for the international community as well.
Well, let's recall that Syria belongs to an axis of terrorism. You have Iran, which foments terrorism around the world. Syria is its top ally and has enabled Iranian support for Hezbollah, which is a viciously anti-Semitic terrorist organization that has killed Americans and Westerners, and of course Israelis, and fires rockets on civilian areas in Israel and calls for the destruction of Israel repeatedly. Syria is in the center of this. So I think for the international community, there's no question that removing Syria from the scene, and we fully recognize we don't know who's coming next, and it's probably not someone who's a Jeffersonian Democrat. But currently, Syria is with the worst and most dangerous nuclear proliferating axis in the world. And I think the international community, not only, as you said, for the Syrian people themselves, but for the peace of the world, needs to help Assad leave and leave now.
Hillel Neuer is with UN Watch, joining us on the line from Geneva in Switzerland. Thank you, Hillel.
My pleasure.